Now looking at it as a whole set, the books really speak to each other. Like when I talk about Hour of the Star, I want to talk about Malina. I want to talk about Tropic of Cancer. When I talk about Malina, I want to talk about Gravity's Rainbow. When I talk about Waiting for the Barbarians, I want to talk about Sheltering Sky. Because the themes just kind of, the authors, not just the idea of control, but I think that concept and the different permutations of that concept, the authors approach that in so many different ways, but also overlapping ways. Thanks for following along season 2 of the Books of Some Substance podcast. The theme this season was all about control. We looked at 6 books that dealt with control in different ways. But in the podcast, we didn't always delve deeply into the idea of control because these books are really about so much more than just one theme. But for this episode, wrapping up the whole season, we're going to return to the books that we read and look more explicitly at the theme of control.
So Nathan, why don't we start where this season started with Clarice Lispector's The Hour of the Star. This is a novel that follows a short period in this young woman's life. She's a typist, she's poor, she's somewhere in Brazil, and she's dealing with poverty, gender discrimination, outside, I guess, maybe it's more societal forces, and I guess her own innocence or naivete, however you want to describe it. And why don't we start with a quote?
And that's how time passed for the girl. She blew her nose on the hem of her underwear. She didn't have that delicate thing called charm. I'm the only one who finds her charming. Only I, her author, love her. I suffer for her. And I'm the only one who can say this. What do you ask of me weeping that I wouldn't give you singing? That girl didn't know she was what she was, just as a dog doesn't know it's a dog. So she didn't feel unhappy. The only thing she wanted was to live. She didn't know for what. She didn't ask questions. Maybe she thought there was a little bitty glory in living. She thought people had to be happy, so she was. Before her birth, was she an idea? Before her birth, was she dead? And after her birth, she would die? What a thin slice of watermelon.
That's the quote that we used to open the episode.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah.
Well, that's a very fitting quote. I mean, I think it covers a lot of what this book is about. It introduces the narrator as a character and the narrator's peculiar relationship with Macabea, the typist. And it talks about this her sort of pre-conscious state of mind, the sort of innocent freedom that she seems to experience, or at least that the narrator leads us to believe that she experiences. And that's maybe, it's a very critical part of the story, which, the story could be and maybe it is. I think maybe some people read it as a very sort of social justice kind of story about how unfair it is that this young woman is poor and underprivileged. But something that's beautiful about Lispector's writing and telling of the story is how much sympathy and empathy and fondness that she seems to bring to this character, and how in some ways, I think the narrator, who's explicitly in the story not Lispector, says right here, the narrator has a lot of affection for this character, and maybe even maybe envy is too strong of a word, but seeing her innocent state as being something maybe worth preserving.
Yeah. So I think you kind of talked about three ways control plays out in this novel, which is, and all kind of connected to the main sort of negation of control, which is this lack of agency on Macabea's part. And that's through her innocence, through the societal factors, and then lastly, through that frame narrative of her being a character in the hands of this writer. The writer's name is
Rodrigo S.M.
Rodrigo S.M. And you get the sense that he can make her do whatever he wants, but also at the same time that he can't. He can't. That she is alive in her own unique way, and he's almost a vessel for letting her story out into the world.
Yeah, and he expresses through the story his sort of discomfort telling the story or inability to truly tell the story. And I think that, I mean, there's so many different ways that you could read this relationship, but the way that I tend to read it is that Lispector is trying to be honest. I think that, I mean, to be honest, I can't help but read a little bit of Lispector into both of these characters, into both Macabea, could be her childhood, could be her young adulthood, coming from the country, coming from a humble beginnings, to her position as a writer, as somebody who knows, to somebody who tells the stories, and having this relationship with her previous self. But I want to ask, in regards to, you mentioned agency, which I think is part of control, but it's not synonymous with control. And Macabea clearly does not have agency. And I think she's not even aware that she doesn't have agency.
I mean, not until the very end, which is her end.
And her very end, yeah. And is agency a prerequisite for control? Or is there a sort of, in the story, Macabea is happy, or she's at least not unhappy. And so many people are unhappy. Macabea, for all the unfairness of the world, is not unhappy.
Well, that's the interesting part. So at the very end, after she listens to the fortune teller and hears all of these things that she's going to get once she steps out the door and into the street, and says, Madame Carlota had gotten everything right. Macabea was stunned. Only then did she see that her life was miserable. She felt like crying when she saw her other side. She who, as I said, had always thought she was happy. And so there's this dichotomy of, if you think that you are happy, can you actually not be happy? Is there a distinction between thought and reality?
Right. And if you aren't aware that you are controlled, are you controlled? Like, if you believe that you are free, are you effectively free for your own experience?
Well, this is interesting. This is going to connect to a bunch of the other books, especially the next book, actually. So here's the connection. We talked previously, we had a hard time connecting this novel with Gravity's Rainbow. And that's something that Gravity's Rainbow addresses, which is the idea of believing you are free and literally seeing the outside sources that control your circumstances that make you unfree, which is, I think, part of, and we can get into it when we go to the next book, which is part of Pynchon's larger postmodern critique of the sense that you actually have any agency at all or self at all, that you are just this pastiche culture and history and everything else.
Oh, this is so good. I mean, these two books, first two books, are probably the least alike of all the books that we've read.
In terms of like narrative form and
length,
yeah. Style,
subject matter. But what you are saying draws such an excellent connection between the two, because in Macabea's case, I mean, it's not dissimilar. It's just the story is very much told differently. And Macabea, it's not about those structural systematic methods of control, but yet Makabe is caught in all of that anyway. She's just perfectly unaware of it. And it's about that pre-aware state that this one is sort of the precursor to Gravity's Rainbow before Slothrop or anybody else is aware of any of the machinations of society. And then also just the way that Lispector tells this story, this poetic, flowing language, could hardly be any more different than Pynchon.
Yes, Lispector is a way of, and I don't know what her writing process was, but the end results makes it feel very in the moment, which is maybe one of the reasons why there is that frame narrative structure of seeing the writer creating the story almost as it's happening for the writer, not the character necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's lines, there's moments, there's shifts that feel so unnatural that it feels like you're watching someone write in the moment, almost. I don't know how related that is, but that's okay.
Should we go ahead and move into Gravity's Rainbow? I mean, I feel like that was a beautiful segue.
In the twisted, guilt-playing room, his secret motions clarify for him some. The odds they played here belong to the past only. Their odds were never probabilities, but frequencies already observed. It's the past that makes demands here. It whispers and reaches after, and sneering disagreeably gooses its victims. When they chose numbers, red, black, odd, even, what did they mean by it? What wheel did they set in motion? And here, they is capitalized. It's they, the forces. Back in a room early in Slothrop's life, a room forbidden to him now, is something very bad. Something was done to him, and it may be that Katja knows what. Hasn't he, in her futureless look, found some link to his own past? Something that connects them closely as lovers? He sees her standing at the end of a passage in her life, without any step to take. All her bets are in. She has only the tedium now of being knocked from one room to the next, a sequence of numbered rooms whose numbers do not matter, till inertia brings her to the last. That's all. Naive Slothrop never thought anybody's life could end like that. Nothing so bleak. But by now, it's grown much less strange to him. He's been snuggling up, masturbatorily scared, elated, to the disagreeable chance that exactly such control might already have been put over him. And there again, control is capitalized. The forbidden wing, oh, the hand of a terrible croupier, is that touch on the sleeves of his dreams. All in his life of what has looked free or random is discovered to have been under some control, all the time, the same as a fixed roulette wheel, where only destinations are important. Attention is to long-term statistics, not individuals, and where the house always does, of course, keep turning a profit. That's kind of early-ish in the book, about 200 or so pages in to the edition, this one. And I think it gets at a few things there about control in terms of the people that have designs on other people's lives, and the past as being a sort of anchor to the notion of free will in the present and the future. There's a few different things going on there, but I think it does a decent sense, at least introducing one of the main ideas of control, or at least, or two rather.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to be honest. I have a hard time reading Gravity's Rainbow.
I don't think you have to be ashamed of that. Most people do. I did until I finally finished it. It's not an easy read by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah.
It's convoluted. It's complex. It's a pastiche of genres and styles and characters and references and allusions.
What role do you think that this the style, the overall style that he uses to write this story, what role does that play in the concept, or in sort of revealing the complexity of the systems of control that influence the characters' lives? I guess I'm struck by, are you supposed to understand it? Are you supposed to be overwhelmed and confused?
Yes, I think is the short answer. You're supposed to be. There's no way anyone who is not the author, and even he says he doesn't remember parts of the things that he wrote, um, can make sense of the allusions, the references, the songs, the names, the history, the symbolism. It is purposely confusing and overwhelming in part because it's trying to make you feel like you don't even have control as a reader over understanding, because its message, if there is a single, there isn't one necessarily, but one thing that it certainly conveys is in its characters and as a reader is that chaos is necessary in order for you to get a sense of, I don't know how to explain it. It's like peeling back something to see just how chaotic things are, to make it seem like you do have control over your life. It's revealing all of the things that influence every aspect of your life in a way to rid you of the idea that you do have control over the things that you think, feel, see, experience, etc.
Because maybe in a more typical or pre-postmodern narrative, the end result of a narrative is generally that you understand, right? It
Yeah,
follows a pattern, it reaches a conclusion, it's satisfying, and that it brings together various things into something that feels like a whole. And Gravity's Rainbow refuses, it just throws stuff at you, but refuses to bring it all together for you.
exactly. And even so, like in this work and in his other more famous and much more readable and more read work, The Crying of Lot 49, right? He plays around with the quest narrative and how usually, you go through this journey, you come to some sort of understanding, some knowledge, some awareness. We can get into how we define those terms. And yeah, he upends those, and there's no answer at the end. And sometimes the quest fades away. Yeah, it's a very cynical book, for sure. I mean, it's funny, and I think you almost have to have a sense of humor if you're going to be that cynical about the world. Otherwise, it's just depressing.
Yeah.
It also is. So, But it's a lot of fun to read, I think, if you can give into that you're not going to understand everything.
Yeah.
There will be no satisfactory ending. Even
And maybe,
the novel ends almost like with a freeze frame before a monumental thing happens. And you never get that satisfying conclusion. I think I've compared this book to Dr. Strangelove before. And in Dr. Strangelove, you have that weird catharsis of Armageddon at the end with the really beautiful, what's the song that plays at the end?
We'll Meet Again.
Yeah. We'll meet again. Don't know where, don't know. That, yeah. And while you just see nuclear bombs going off all over the world. But here, it literally freezes The missile hangs over the Orpheum Theater, and you don't see it, you don't feel it, you don't get anything from it. It just, yeah. Although, yeah, maybe it kind of does give it to you, but it does give you a song too at the end, which is very similar.
I
Yeah,
wish somebody could sing these songs to me. Like,
right. I think somebody does. Somebody takes them. Yeah.
oh,
I
nice.
mean, the song that ends the actual novel is "There's a hand to turn the time, though thy glass today be run, till the light that hath brought the towers low find the last poor preterite one, till the riders sleep by every road, all through our crippled zone, with a face on every mountainside and a soul in every stone. Now, everybody, it's like all together. Here we go, right?" And I just remembered the preterite. Did you get into the book's idea of preterite at all? And what this word means? These are the people that are, these are kind of like the lower class, the ones that aren't involved with the machinations of world affairs,
Mm.
right?
Our Maccabeus.
Our Maccabeus, exactly. So another thread.
Another thread tied.
Is there anything you want to say? Anything you want to add? Anything way you want to transition? Any connections you want to make to another book?
I just want to call out at a sort of conceptually at a high level the kind of the different kinds of controls that or ideas about control that we're talking about. So I think in Gravity's Rainbow, it's very much systems of control or structural control, and how the individuals are totally subsumed by these structures and the readers subsumed by these systems. And in Hour of the Star, we have very clearly a narrative sense of control, and we have very clearly I think the idea about Maccabea and whether or not she has any control. But I think that we're introduced with this idea of this the relationship between the inner and the outer, and it's very much about this woman's inner sanctuary, where her external situations she has no control, but inside there's something sort of innocent preserved, which I think is a theme that we're going to return to in the next book,
Which is
Waiting for the Barbarians. This now we've got structures of control invading, piercing that inner sanctum.
and this one is much more, I think it's much more clear, much more direct, much more
Oh, it's told
localized.
almost like
Yeah.
a parable. I mean,
Yes.
compared to the first two, which, regardless of their content, just there's an artistry to the way that they're written and the way that they're read that you can just kind of admire without the whatever theme or message. And Waiting for the Barbarians, I think, is a beautiful story, beautifully written too. But there's a parable quality to it that feels like there's something that you need to take away from this story.
Yes. The first two books, you could enjoy them and should enjoy them for their artistic merit. And this one, yeah, it feels much more directed at sending some kind of message to its reader. It feels much more moralistic, at least explicitly. Why don't we read a nice passage to start it off?
How can I regard myself as a victim of persecution when my sufferings are so petty? Yet they are all the more degrading for their pettiness. I remember smiling when the door first closed behind me and the key turned in the lock. It seemed no great infliction to move from the solitariness of everyday existence to the solitude of a cell when I could bring with me a world of thoughts and memories. But now I begin to comprehend how rudimentary freedom is. What freedom has been left to me? The freedom to eat or go hungry, to keep my silence, or gabble to myself, or beat on the door or scream. If I was the object of an injustice, a minor injustice when they locked me in here. I am now no more than a pile of blood, bone, and meat that is unhappy. What I like about that quote is this transition from being free or believing that you're free to that liminal state of being neither free nor controlled, where you're still going through the motions, you're behaving as you did previously, to the ultimate state of no longer seeing that as freedom. And you could say, well, was it freedom before? But now it's gone from the experience, feeling, believing that you're free, like we were talking about, to now believing that you're not free, to feeling as I'm only a body that is unhappy. I am just this material being.
Because the freedom to choose between screaming and kicking at a locked door and not is not real freedom.
Well, I think the question that it raises, I mean, in his transition from, maybe we should take a step back real quick and remind everybody what this book is about.
Okay, yeah.
What the heck are we talking about? So in this book, it takes place on some frontier of the empire, and it's a first-person narrative of a sort of backwater magistrate who's biding his time when he hears word that the barbarians are going to invade. And once that word comes and the empire starts to express itself at the frontier, all sorts of cruelties begin to happen, and he comes to have a very different opinion about the empire and his place in it.
And the Empire is given a face and a name in Colonel Joel and his ruthless. It has the dressing of a sort of search for truth or search for what the barbarians are doing, but really only is meant as a violent reminder of Empire's power.
So I think we can get back to what we were just talking about, this idea of freedom, where the magistrate begins, he thinks he feels himself to be free. He believes he's free. I mean, he has his job, he has his duties, whatever. He has things he has to do, but he feels himself to be free. Through this process of degradation that the empire subjects him to, and Colonel Joel subjects him to, he feels himself to no longer be free. But he is now aware, or I would say aware.
Okay.
You would say.
Now he knows.
Yeah.
But I think what we're talking about is truth. Some truth.
Kind of. Truth is such a heavy word.
It is. So the reality of the situation. How do you want to phrase it?
The reality of the situation. I want to say aware. He is now aware of the reality of the situation. Okay. This has now become a running gag between you and me.
Yeah. So just before we recorded this, we got into a very long semantic argument in which we agreed on the results. How do you want to phrase that? We disagreed about the terms between knowing and being aware of something.
Yeah. Which one is closer to the reality itself?
Yeah.
Is knowledge or awareness closer to reality itself?
Yeah. I view awareness as a sort of vague perception and knowing as understanding the reality of something, or
where I would say that knowing is a conceptualization, and awareness is a direct experience.
So it's just a difference in terms.
Yeah.
So anyway,
but yeah, detour back to our original route.
Yes.
This reminds me of Gravity's Rainbow. And we have again the concept of knowledge. We have again the concept of sort of, I mean, I think in Gravity's Rainbow, it's not just state power, right? It's corporate power.
It's
It's
state power, it's
scientific
core
power.
power, it's scientific power, it's cultural power. It's yeah, it's
So in Waiting for the
yeah.
Barbarians, it's just distilled. It's just the state. It's just the empire, and then that empire also doesn't act in nuanced ways the way it does in Gravity's Rainbow. It's not a multitude of ways. They single out one man and they deliberately and methodically break down the walls of his inner self control to attempt to destroy him. And the result of that is that he sort of he experiences this sort of rebirth, right?
Yes, but he also becomes aware of his own prior complicity in Empire's control, even if it was passive, right? You see that through his sexualization of the native girl and the way he treats her. He doesn't view what he's doing as somehow having unequal power dynamics at all. But I think he comes to that realization later through his own degradation at the hands of Empire. And through that, also his own role in this outpost and what it may or may not have done to the native people outside of the town's walls or city's walls, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, because he was living almost like Macabea in a state of innocence, right?
Yeah, sort of, right?
And that once you take a bite of that knowledge, um, yeah,
Or the knowledge bites you in this case.
yeah, I think that's what ends up happening almost always in a lot of these books. Knowing the reality or being aware of the reality, however you want to phrase it, um, getting that self awareness, perhaps,
Yeah.
is dangerous because it means you need to do something to take control over the things that are happening in your life. That there's all of these, there's state control, there's one's past, there's the gender control issues, there's the trauma of war, whether it's Gravity's Rainbow or Malina, there's, whatever these things are that control how you fit into the world and how you perceive yourself in it. And if you start to kind of chop away at those things and become more self-aware that you need to do things in order to maybe take back control of your life in some way, whether you think that's even possible, I think Pynchon will argue that that's impossible, or the only way it is possible is if you disappear and fade into something.
Well, in Waiting for the Barbarians and in Hour of the Star, that awareness does not bring a greater sense of control. It doesn't bring a greater sense of happiness. It doesn't improve the lives of anyone. Which I think, Macabea, the narrative device is that she gets hit by a car. Maybe that has nothing to do with her, but that's how the author wraps that up. And the great moral of Waiting for the Barbarians is once he comes to have this true knowledge or awareness of the reality of the empire, is he can't do anything. He can't change it. He can't fix it. He can't do his job anymore. So he is the only action he can take is to try to continue to be aware, and that's the sort of moral imperative Like, it doesn't result in anything. That's just what you have to do.
And I think maybe because Coetzee seems to be telling that parable, that sort of middle path of acceptance and continued perseverance to try to do that, to be aware, is kind of maybe the best case scenario, because the opposites would be, or the extremes would be Kit in Sheltering Sky, who abandons all agency, abandons all control over herself, and puts herself into the complete and total hands of other people or fate or whatever it is. And you have Miller, who is this solipsistic, strive to control every aspect of your life, no matter how wretched it might be. Even if it does have beauty in it, it's still, it's not a life most people would choose to live.
Mm-hmm.
Those almost stand as like opposite extremes of attempts to wrestle control or agency over oneself.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting in Coetzee's book. It seems that this is a true moral imperative that he's trying to communicate. It's not just a narrative. It's not just part of the story.
Yeah.
Like, I think you could say, well, in Hour of the Star, it's just part of the story. It's not required that she gets by a car. If you realize you're unhappy, you're not going to literally die.
Yeah.
That's not the point of the story. Maybe that's metaphorical. Maybe things get harder when you realize you're unhappy, or you should be unhappy, or life is unfair.
That some part of you dies, right? That naive part, that innocent part of you dies.
But I think that Lispector also walks this line where it doesn't seem to me that she is expressing that one ought to realize one's own wretchedness. That there is a sort of special place for those who do not realize their own wretchedness.
Yes.
It has to do a lot, I think, with the quality of her writing. I mean, it's just her writing itself occupies this space.
Yes. I mean, and it has such religious overtones throughout the book that, this meekness, this grace in Macabea is, you and the narrator, like you mentioned, have sympathy for her. Even if you do recognize, because it's presented that it's not the reality. It's not reality. There is her sense of the world, but then there is reality. And so Lispector's book is a very interesting case in that regard, because there's no... The reader has much more control over how they interpret what that means in the end.
Yeah.
Because it's so much more elusive. Where I think a lot of these other works, there's a much more clear way or consistent way of interpreting what message might be hidden if we're looking at this theme of control for the reader than not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yet, we can talk about the character of Macabea and the character of the magistrate, but I think a critical difference is also that the magistrate is writing his story.
Yeah.
And so for all the degradation that he experiences, for the revelation that he experiences, it's very much a first-person narrative, and he's telling you what he has learned, as opposed to in Macabea's case, you in the writing you feel very close to Macabea, but it's very expressly not her telling the story, which I think is another interesting aspect of control in these narratives.
Yeah. At least the indicator of lack of, because Macabea would be unable to tell her story. It would just be, it would be too childlike and innocent, and this is what I did through this day. You would have almost no story to tell.
Yeah, which is kind of the way that it's written. I mean,
in a way, yes.
Like jumps around.
Yeah.
Kind of randomly.
Mm. I think you can tell how much we like Hour of the Star that we keep coming back to it.
It's basically our reference point for the rest of these books. Well, Malina's already come up a couple of times actually, and we've been talking about the sort of the language, the peculiar language of Hour of the Star, and language itself becomes the central focal point of Malina and the central axis of control, linguistic control, that deeper than the structures of control in corporations and the state. Language, the very tool that you have to navigate the world, to express reality to yourself, is itself controlling you. And I've got a quote for you. I will tell you a terrible secret. Language is punishment. Language must encompass all things, and in it, all things must again transpire according to guilt and the degree of guilt. Malina was, I mean, Gravity's Rainbow is difficult in its own right. Malina, the form of Malina, I found quite challenging.
Yes. I think Gravity's Rainbow bombards you, and Malina obfuscates.
Yeah.
Like it's a hard work to pierce through. And we had this conversation, I think, when we recorded it. You almost have to read it twice. The first time is just to kind of get through it and get a feel for how it's working or how you think it might be working.
It didn't make, or it made almost no sense to me the first time I read it. I didn't understand what she was doing. And I think that I believe that there's a sort of utopianism, I think, in Malina, as bleak as the work is. There's a sort of utopianism that doesn't exist in Waiting for the Barbarians or Gravity's Rainbow. There's a sort of belief that it is possible to pierce through language, to create a new language. And I think that that's what she's trying to do in the sort of strange, choppy style that she writes in, is try to pierce through language, because I think in her understanding, this language is itself a byproduct and therefore a tool of the patriarchy that has led Austria to fascism, that led her father to fascism, and that's her inheritance.
Yeah.
The tools of fascism, and she's trying to break that apart.
There is that passage, though, where it's not just a tool for fascism, but it is also the way to resist it. Right? Do you remember when they're coming and they're taking all of her books?
Yes.
You know what I'm talking
Three
about?
stones.
Yeah, exactly. So there's that the tools of oppression and the tools of a resistance are almost the same thing, but
Yes.
you have to alter and adjust these in order to use the tools of oppression and control against itself. You have to change it and alter it and make it new, make it unique.
And I think this is where this kind of utopianism comes from. And there's a strange fantasy aspect of this book where she is the unnamed author, or unnamed I, is working on a sort of fantasy book.
The unknown woman, is that how she refers to herself in some of the letters, something like that? Yeah.
But let me read the passage that you're referring to. They are 3 hard luminous stones which have been thrown to me by the highest authority, where even my father has no influence, and I alone know what message each stone contains. Young lightning is constantly flashing inside the first reddish stone, which has fallen from heaven into my cell. It says, "Live in wonder." The second blue stone, flashing with all possible hues of blue, says, "Write in wonder." And I am already holding the third stone in my hand, white and radiant, whose fall can be stopped by no one, not even my father. But the cell grows dark. That third stone's message cannot be read. The stone can no longer be seen. I shall discover this final message after I am freed. It's so beautiful.
Yeah.
And there's a So she was Ingeborg Bachmann was very interested in Wittgenstein, which we talked about in the episode.
Yeah.
And Wittgenstein is a very interesting 20th century philosopher, also Austrian, also a product of fascism or an inheritor of fascism. Also critical of knowledge, which we haven't talked about yet, which we should talk about because knowledge has played into all these books that we've been talking about so far.
Well, yeah. I mean, just the ending where the controversial is Malina real knowledge and the phone call and the disappearance into the wall and the sense of knowing. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
But what's the famous Wittgenstein quote? That which cannot be
Put into language must, or that
be
which you
passed over
cannot,
in silence. That cannot be spoken
yeah,
must be passed over
passed
in
over in
silence.
silence. Yes. Sorry, say that again. I fucked it up.
That which cannot be spoken must be passed over in silence. And I think that reminds me of the white stone whose message cannot be read. That there's an aspect of reality that language cannot access.
Yeah.
And that gives us hope that reality is there. We're not totally bound by the language that we've inherited.
Anyone who has experienced, who has known, I will say, anyone who has known love knows how useless language can be sometimes to express that.
Yeah.
Right? Or anyone who has experienced some ineffable thing through art or music knows that you cannot describe it.
And that you shouldn't be forcing these experiences through language.
Yes. And in a way, she's trying to sort of capture these things in a way that's evading direct description, but experiences that require language, and that through reading it, you feel and experience something, but it's not simple narrative, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you mean by she's trying to sort of create a new approach? At the very beginning of introducing this book, you said that Bachmann is trying to sort of create a new language. And I wasn't sure if you meant that idea that in order to experience these indescribable things, but you're still choosing to write, right?
Yeah, well, I think that is the paradox. And I think
Yeah.
that it's the awareness that there is this ineffable, inexpressible reality, but that we need, having experienced that. I don't know if she did experience that or if she believed in that. She clearly did believe in that reality. And as a writer, or maybe as a human, as a communicator, needing, in spite of Wittgenstein's warning, to find a way to express that, to find a way. I think this is what poetry does. And Ingeborg Bachmann actually was a poet before she was and she's maybe more famous in the German-speaking world for her poetry than she is for the one novel that she wrote. And I think this is what poetry often does, is it uses words, but it's not the words that express the poetry. It's what happens in your mind between the words with this particular combination of words. It's not that these words stack up like bricks and form a facade of reality, which I think is that, to get back to the idea of knowledge, that's what I think of when we say knowledge. It's like this stack of bricks that is a textbook that tells you the way the world is. And I think what she's saying is that's not the way the world is. And that's in poetry frequently. That's not the way the world is. The world is something else that you need to experience. And I think that's what she's doing in this book. It's a sort of, maybe, is a poem novel? It's not the most poetic book. I think Hour of the Stars, the language is more poetic. But I think that there's still that aspect of trying to be more than the sum of the words.
Yes. Because I don't know how to say this, actually.
We'll pass over it in silence.
Let's just pass it over in silence.
No, what were you going to say?
Well, in linguistic like structuralism, there's this idea of signifier and signified. Are you familiar with
Hmm.
these kind of ideas?
Hmm.
That the word is trying to get at what it's signifying, what it's trying to represent as a concept or idea, and that there's, you know, a certain number, if not unlimited, complications between the two. And yet, in most everyday instances, we know we can bridge those gaps pretty easily because we're talking about just basic daily things. And when it comes to poetry or fiction, as opposed to visual art or music, which I think is probably the greatest at capturing that ineffable thing about humanity, beauty, whatever it is, fear, pain, etc., in a way that language is not necessary. Um, but because she is a writer and she is a poet, she's trying to do she's trying to use these limitations not only as an affront to oppression and fascism, even though that seems to be a big part of the narrative, especially sort of patriarchal control in the two men that control our unnamed narrator. But like you said, that third thing, that stone, is it just that idea? Because there's no hint at much of, almost kind of like Makabe, that there's much of a life to the narrator outside of her relationship to these men. I mean,
Hmm.
there's like little things like the letters that she writes and the people that she interviews. Um, there's that one man that she interviews, another famous writer. I can't remember if it's ever named, which is a very
That'll
silly and
it's
strange.
funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a funny section, the interview.
I guess I just don't know what is she building towards. So she's sort of structuring this novel in such an unusual way for you to feel something,
Hmm.
because you get the sense, like you've mentioned, that she can't just directly say it, that
Hmm.
saying it will dilute it, or maybe it's unsayable.
Yeah. Well, but maybe that's okay. I mean, maybe she through this her peculiar use of language. We talked about it before, like just the half expressed phone calls, um, the operatic structure and some of the dialogue. Um, she constantly throws these linguistic devices at you. It shifts gears seemingly, like, not maybe not arbitrarily, but without expectation, and you're kind of constantly on your toes. And maybe there's not.
To what end is what I'm asking. Like, what purpose does that serve as as a work for a reader? Like, what do you think? Like, one, how did you respond to it, if you can remember, and how do you think one should respond to it?
Well, to be perfectly honest, I responded with confusion.
Okay.
I didn't get it
Okay.
the first time that I read it. And this is a novel, I think generally I would say one ought to enjoy one's novels, regardless of the point that the author is trying to make. This is not a novel that I enjoyed. It's as in the reading experience of it. I experienced it. It was an experience, but it's a novel that I've enjoyed immensely thinking and talking about. So it's a bit of an anomaly for me.
Okay.
Um, and that's influenced by reading more of other things that she wrote or talked about. Um, and she's directly the one who sent me down my Wittgenstein journey.
So, in a way, there's a connection there in terms of um, the role a reader has for understanding or interpreting a work with Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. because it
Yeah.
is very much on your shoulders to ferret out any sort of pleasure or meaning in the reading experience. In a sense, if we want to tie this back to our theme of control,
Yeah.
because we kind of gone off the rails a bit, readerly control. You are in control of how you piece things together to make meaning.
And I think that there's also, just on the formal aspect of it, the result is the reader has to piece together meaning. But formally, I think that Pynchon and Bachmann are kind of doing a similar kind of thing. They're trying to throw the reader off to express what is off about the world. Because if they were to just write a simple narrative, then you read it, you enjoy it, on your 4-hour flight, you
And
give it away.
maybe not enjoy is the right word, but easily digest, because it's not like reading Waiting for the Barbarians is enjoyable. You're not like picturing these horrible scenes of torture and going, this is a good time, right? But it's easily digestible in terms of like
Yeah.
how you picture it in your mind or how the narrative flows. It has a very simple
But
and good.
there is a joy to it, though, don't you think? I mean, not you don't enjoy the content, but I found Waiting for the Barbarians like a real page turner.
Well, yeah.
Like, just like, I enjoyed the reading
I see
process.
what you mean.
It
Yes, the
kept me
process itself.
engaged
Yes.
constantly. Like, I read that book extremely fast.
Yeah.
And versus like Malina, I would read a page and go cross-eyed and fall asleep and dread the next time I had to pick it up.
And yet, I find both are incredible. Takes an incredible amount of talent.
Yeah, for sure.
Because I think Malina, there's probably a number of experimental narrative structures, and I've read a few, and they're just dog shit. They are experimental for the sake of the experiment without any sort of driving philosophy. And then there's probably a lot of books that want to be page turners, but are not, or they don't have anything of interest behind the page turning. Right. So I think they both, and that's probably why we chose them for this. But yeah. Anyway, we're all over the place on this one.
Yeah, well, I think it's a challenging book to read. It's a challenging book to talk about. But in case you missed it, she becomes Malina.
She becomes Malina.
Well, there's another aspect of control. So the actual plot of Malina being what it is also very much about control.
Yeah, it's a woman slowly having her identity completely erased by the men of her life,
and or maybe society at large. Yeah, all right. Maybe that kind of sums it up.
It really does. I mean, in terms of a nice little ribbon to put on it. Sure. Speaking of women having their identities totally erased, she was no more disturbed by other people as such than the marble statue is by the flies that crawl on it. However, as possible harbingers of undesirable events and wielders of unfavorable influence in her own life, she accorded other people supreme importance. She would say, "Other people rule my life," and it was true. But she allowed them to do it only because her superstitious fancy had invested them with magical importance regarding her own destiny, and never because their personalities awoke any profound sympathy or understanding in her. That's weird. In a way, there's a sense of like choosing, which is agency, choosing not to have control or choosing to give up.
So we have Macabea, who has not chosen but is in the state of absence of control. We have the magistrate, who has it control violently taken from him and forced into this state of
Submission, obedience.
Yeah. And then we have this active pursuit, this active choice to give over one's own control.
She submits completely in order to negate herself.
And that's the whole thrust of this novel, really, is these two Americans heading into the Sierra, running away from sort of their Western roots and looking for a way to give themselves over to something. I think they're not even clear what they're pursuing.
No. I think it's clear that the pursuing, they want to find this balance of erasing themselves, but only under the circumstances of their choosing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because they could easily lose themselves in New York, where they come from, in a world of money and things. But they're escaping that in a way, because it seems, even though you never see their life prior to them traveling, you have a sense that, and often Port kind of makes reference to it, that he's kind of sick. He's sick of the life he lived and had.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of like trying to change circumstances where he is, he confuses, as a lot of people do, I think, the idea of, if I just change where I am physically, I can somehow change who I am.
Well, let's compare this to Waiting for the Barbarians, because we also have this, Waiting for the Barbarians is sort of in this fantasy world, but it's very much a Western world versus a non-Western world, or engaging with a non-Western world, which is what we have here. And so for the magistrate, blissfully unaware that he was of the conflict here, he wasn't seeking to go any further than the frontier. I mean, obviously, he wasn't
and his interest in the barbarians was academic, right? He would go out to the ruins. He would try to study the text, so to speak, of these markings that they made on these pieces. It was one of knowledge, the way you understand it, as academic knowledge, almost anthropological.
This incursion into the maybe let's call it pre-conscious state. Maybe that's what's going on here, because Maccabea comes into this. Maccabea exists in this pre-conscious state. She's killed by the car. She's killed by knowledge. She's killed by knowledge of her unhappiness. In, obviously in Waiting for the Barbarians, we have Joel and the army going out and killing the barbarians. And in Sheltering Sky, one of the reasons that Port expresses for his disdain for Western civilization is that it's changing Africa, that it's not the way it was, that the war has changed everything, that wherever you go, everywhere is like Europe. What does that mean exactly? It's not exactly clear, but he wants to get away from that state of mind, he wants to get away from the state of mind of Western civilization. Let's bring in Gravity's Rainbow. What is that state of mind of Western civilization? Corporate influence, state power, science, telling you what reality is, and you can't piece it out. You just know somewhere deep inside you that you're not free. Your mind isn't free. You want that pre-conscious state. And maybe the magistrate is blessed by having it ripped away from him in a way. He's forced into, he doesn't, it's not exactly fair, because it's not exactly true, because he doesn't go to a pre-conscious state. He kind of is between worlds at the end of it.
That's why I kind of made reference to him to being seen almost as a kind of middle path in a way. And Port and Kit, throughout the book, they move further and further into the Sahara. They move further and further into that state of being. And Kit eventually sort of gives in completely, whereas Port is existing. There's that great line in this book early on about tourism, about a tourist and a traveler,
Mm-hmm.
And Port seems to be ridiculing one and praising the other, but always kind of being both at the same time.
He holds on to part of himself. He holds on to that westernization part of himself, and maybe that's what contributes to his death.
What Bowles is doing is critiquing that desire in a way, right? Because there's nothing sympathetic about Port's mind. I mean, there's a way you can like kind of understand where he's coming from, but yet see how flawed he is in his execution of that mentality.
And Bowles is something like Bowles himself, the writer, is something like the magistrate. He lives on the frontier between Europe and Africa, smoking keef and minding his own business. not not trying to do too much. I think you're right. There's an aspect of sort of ridiculing this idealism that it is possible to to re to re-enter or to abandon the machinations that control you.
That
Mm-hmm.
you know, the past, these people untouched by Western civilization are somehow better because they're untouched by it. It's not saying that one is necessarily greater than the other.
Right. I think there's an aspect of it like we're all stuck. We're not getting out one way or another.
Yeah, I think that's it. Because it's not like Bela Kassim is some great savior for Kit.
Right.
You know? Yeah. And again, like the passage that I read, she's abandoning herself to this man because he's some great representation of this ideal. She's just doing it because he's there. And she needs someone to take responsibility for her life because she can't do it herself, it seems. You don't really get much motivation for that, which is interesting. But you get this sense that the world as it is in this post-world environment for these Western elite don't know what to do with themselves.
So speaking of not knowing what to do with yourself, maybe this is a good segue into our final book, Tropic of Cancer.
It is now the fall of my second year in Paris. I was sent here for a reason I have not yet been able to fathom. I have no money, no resources, no hopes. I am the happiest man alive. A year ago, 6 months ago, I thought that I was an artist. I no longer think about it. I am. Everything that was literature has fallen from me. There are no more books to be written, thank God. This is not a book. This is libel, slander, defamation of character. This is not a book in the ordinary sense of the word. No, this is a prolonged insult, a gob of spit in the face of art, a kick in the pants to God, man, destiny, time, love, beauty, what you will. I'm going to sing for you, a little off-key perhaps, but I will sing. I will sing while you croak. I will dance over your dirty corpse. To sing, you must first open your mouth. You must have a pair of lungs and a little knowledge of music. It is not necessary to have an accordion or guitar. The essential thing is to want to sing. This, then, is a song. I am singing.
Actually, let's go through this. Hour of the Star, Macabea, preconscious innocence, achieves awareness, dies. Gravity's Rainbow, Slothrop
Disintegrates, essentially.
disintegrates. Through, I mean, he's not exactly pursuing knowledge, right? The knowledge.
Well, he kind of is in a way, and there's a lot of other characters also trying to pursue some kind of knowledge or some kind of grasp on things, or they're pursuing a holy grail of modernity in the V2 rocket. There's these quest for grasping control in some way, and I think Slothrop, his is a sort of unraveling of the layers of control of his life from the moment he was a baby and he was experimented on to everything that happens down the road. You get a sense that he becomes hyper aware of all the different hands pulling his strings.
So maybe he's a little bit like the magistrate at the end.
Yeah,
At
but
the end.
it's more you get the sense that it destroys him.
Well, I think in Waiting for the Barbarians, it in a sense destroys the magistrate, who becomes just untethered from anything that was previously giving his life meaning. Malina, our protagonist, disintegrates. Sheltering Sky, our protagonist, dies of typhoid or loses her mind in the desert. Henry Miller is a happy man, sleeping with whores. So, what is his secret?
What is his secret? I think it's, at least in part, indifference. Right? There is, sorry, it's knowledge, it's knowing the world and how it works, and rejecting it, and trying to find one's way outside of it, or at the periphery of it, let's say.
And what is outside? Are we talking about physically outside, mentally outside?
I mean, it's both, because without the means to do so, it's not like he can live comfortably within the world and how it functions. So he's on, on the outskirts. He's in the poor. He's in the slums, and then mentally he's outside of it. We talked about in the episode that he sort of views himself as kind of beyond good and evil, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because those are limitations set by society. Those are systems of control that he doesn't want to be a part of and refuses to be a part of.
Yeah, and I think you just reminded me, we talked about humanity. It was the way that we started the previous episode, and that quote where he makes himself out to be the devil. But that idea of humanity, I think he's playing with the word humanity. But the idea that the use of humanity, that you're being inhuman, where's your humanity, is a powerful tool of control. Right? Like, you are less than human. If you take agency of your own life at the expense of others, which he does to some degree. I mean, I don't think he's, for the most part, evil. But there is a sort of indifference to how it affects others. But his main prerogative is having some kind of ownership and agency of his own, and that makes him less than human.
Yeah. And I think what makes him not evil is because he wants and expects others to do the same. Sorry. He would like others to do the same. And if you don't do the same, that's on you. That's not his responsibility. If you aren't living your authentic life, if you aren't taking agency for your existence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's what keeps him from being evil. But I don't know if evil is the right road to even go down for Miller necessarily. But
I mean, he left his wife and kid, and then he left his second wife, just kind of abandoned them. I mean, his second wife kind of abandoned him first, so maybe there's that. But he did kind of abandon them. And then in the face of what's going on in the world at the time, in the face of the rise of fascism and Hitler and communism, he just says, like, I don't give a shit. And that flies in the face of what we consider now to have been the right thing to do at the time. Like, the right thing to do, obviously, would have been to take a stand on the right side of history. Although I think that was probably a lot less clear at the time, which was the right side of history.
I don't know. It seemed pretty clear for a lot of people.
The
I mean, to be fair, Gravity's Rainbow muddles that quite a bit, especially
yeah,
post-war good guys.
but I think I guess I just say that because it's so obvious now. But there were artists who we have a great deal of respect for who believed that Hitler was doing something good. Ezra Pound was a Nazi sympathizer. Celine was a Nazi sympathizer. Like they thought, and it's not because they were. I don't think it's more. I think it's less probable that they were bad people, that they wanted bad things to happen to people, than that they thought that this political force was going to lead to a better state of humanity.
I think we also, and it's a tricky thing to do, especially with Miller, because his work is at least seemingly and very easily understood as to be autobiographical, or mostly autobiographical, to separate the idea of what might be a good man or good woman and a good artist.
Mm-hmm.
And Miller complicates that because it's autobiographical, and the message, as we've talked about, is this idea of authenticity, living for yourself, living for your passion in the world, even in the face of rising fascism.
And maybe in this way, Henry Miller, and we talked about him being something of being seen as something of a sage, and there's maybe for all the profanity and vulgarity, there's a mystical or a religious aspect of it to it, which I think maybe Malina gets the closest to in the other books that we've read, or maybe Hour of the Star. Although I think Hour of the Star and Malina could very much be read as strictly social commentary, strictly about the material world that we inhabit.
Yeah, but somehow
Rainbow,
the style and form of those two books, I think, break it free from that strict reading. But yeah, anyway, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that Gravity's Rainbow, Waiting for the Barbarians, and even Sheltering Sky, in a way, are much more materially focused books about the material world that we're in and the causes and effects of that material world. And I think Miller is really less concerned with that, and he's more concerned with the causes and the effects of the spiritual world.
Yes, or at least the spiritual world, if you understand it as being a sort of interiority, reconcile your own passion or soul desire, even. I mean, that's a big driving force for Miller.
Mm-hmm.
From the most base of sexual needs to artistic creation and self-understanding.
And I think that's sort of his version of, or that's his spiritual direction, if you will. But this idea that you are responsible for your salvation, I think it links Henry Miller with religious traditions. Like it's not the state that's responsible for your salvation. The state's not going to create you a utopia. The corporations aren't going to create you a utopia. Society's not going to create you a utopia. That utopia is only ever going to exist inside of yourself if you commit yourself to it at the expense of the state, the economy, society.
And yet, imagine a world where everyone behaved like Henry Miller.
I mean, it's hard to imagine, but have we ever had one? Have we ever had one of those worlds?
I don't think it's possible. Well, I don't think anything would get done.
But maybe not as much needs to get done as we think needs to get done.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with how most of the world gets things done. You know, I like being able to talk to you through this nice internet with this camera made out of plastic, which, someone had to drill in order to manufacture. There's a lot in the material world.
No, absolutely. But
without,
are we
appreciating
of like the magistrate who are satisfied in our outpost?
Yes, probably. I think we're a combination of magistrate and Maccabea, because if we were to look at the world and realize all of the things that actually are happening, a la Gravity's Rainbow, we might turn into Kit and just abandon ourselves over to everything and anyone, because actual existence would be insufferable.
I think you won the podcast. I think that was it. You just summarized the entire season in one sentence with all the characters.
There you go.
Although that was a pretty great ending. But I did want to compare just our parentheses of this season, Tropic of Cancer and Hour of the Star, because I think that there's just some peculiar parallels or reflections in these two narratives. The state of poverty in an urban environment, the state of innocence that Maccabea exhibits and that Lispector seems to write in. It seems like a sort of free and innocent way of writing, versus Henry Miller, who's pursuing a kind of, I think he's pursuing a sort of innocence where everything just comes naturally. And he writes with a sort of theatrical, performative way, a performative innocence, a performative naivete. And then finally, the difference between Maccabea's state of innocence being out of her control. And I guess that's really ultimately what it is. Her state of innocence is out of her control. And Henry Miller is pursuing a state of innocence within his control.
Yes, I think that's it. Which is what I was trying to say, that he's aware of the world and how it functions and wants to exist outside of it. Whereas Maccabea has, as soon as she experiences the knowledge, she dies, right? Like, as soon as she realizes the truth of her unhappiness, it's over. The magistrate is forced into the knowledge and finds a way to sort of continue on, because in the end he's still in the village, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the village no longer seems to be connected to the empire.
Yeah. And it's kind of abandoned.
It's essentially abandoned. So what does he do, I guess? How do you view him in relation to Miller or Maccabea?
I mean, I don't think that we really know what happens after that. I think what he says is that he can neither leave the empire, like he can't just go join the barbarians. So he can't leave the empire, but he also can't belong to the empire. And all he can do is really be aware of the situation as it is. I think he leaves you a little unsettled. Like, what does that mean? What do you do? Because you just don't do anything. You just live with guilt.
Was it Bachmann's book that you read about?
Language is guilt, and
yeah, you just live in the guilt.
And Henry Miller is like, no, screw that. I refuse to feel guilt. That's your power. That's your power trying to control me. Because I think Henry Miller, and this is where it gets kind of, mystical again, is it's not about these power structures. Like, the empire will always kill the barbarians. The barbarians will always invade the empire, and that's not what it's about. It's about you finding your own inner sanctum.
Miller's like some sex-crazed 20th century Gnostic. Yeah. He could have easily started a cult, I think.
Absolutely. I feel like it's really fun. It's been really fun talking about these books as a whole, because, we went on this journey together. We didn't know what we were going to be reading. We didn't know what themes were going to come out of this.
It's really interesting to see how these books, that if you were to just see them piled up, go, how are these connected?
Right.
Yeah. And we find ways that they are, through control, through guilt, through awareness. of reality. Yeah. I think it's a fun way to read books.
I mean, this is one of the joys of reading, I think, and reading deliberately, let's say. Looking at these books, it feels like a new story is emerging. A story in which Henry Miller is talking to Clarice Lispector, in which Maccabea is talking to the magistrate. And there's like a freaking plot from beginning to end, from the pre-conscious innocence, the death of that innocence, entering the world, discovering all its machinations, having your freedom taken from you, ultimately surrendering your control of anything outside of yourself, and finding your own particular idiosyncratic salvation. Thanks for listening to Season 2 of the Books of Some Substance podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to hit that like and subscribe button, write us a review. It's really helpful and it helps other people find the podcast. We're going to take a little break. In a couple of months, we'll be back with Season 3. We hope to see you soon. We won't actually see anybody. We hope you'll join us for Season 3 of the Books of Some Substance podcast.